Greetings and welcome to the Destination Goa Trends podcast, bringing in-depth interviews with artists, label people, organizers from the golden age of the 90s to the modern era. My name is Simon Peter and I'm here with the one and only Tibus.
Right, let's talk about Goa Trends. But before we do that, let me remind you to hit the like button and share the show so that other and new people can tune in. If you want to list the best Goa Trends albums, like making a top 10 all time, where would you rank Doof's Let's Turn On? To me, it's definitely in the top 3.
Ooh, that's a tough one, because there are some old favorites on the top, but it's certainly up there amongst my top 10 most influential albums. And it's actually one of the first few I got to listen to when I was getting to know the genre. So it really has a special place in my heart for sure. So what can you tell us about the Doof project in the 90s?
Doof is Nick Barber from the UK. He started in the early 90s, and after one or more experimental sounding EPs, he met Simon Posford. They created a couple of tracks together, and he found his sound. He released many classic tracks on compilation and EPs like Double Dragons, Let's Turn On, Mars Needs Women, or Angelina. In 96, he released the project's first album, which is also one of the genre-defining albums. In the following years, he produced more downtempo and dub tracks.
We had a chance to talk to Nick twice. In this first episode, we explored the roots of the Doof project and the Goa years. Enjoy!
How did you actually become a musician? Because in the 90s, you played electronic music, and then came acoustic music. So which one was first?
Well, the acoustic music actually was first. I started off playing guitar when I was in my teens. I guess 14, 15, I picked up a guitar for the first time. And I had a friend who was a lot better at guitar than I was, and he taught me a few chords, and I kind of jumped on that kind of punk philosophy of, okay, you know 3 chords, so let's write a song. And I was immediately trying to write my own songs with like a very limited grasp of guitar playing, but that was just something that I kind of started to do straight away. And then I used to go out and do like open mics and stuff. When I was 17, 18, I would show up with my guitar and sing my songs. And I mean, this is mid 80s, I guess, something like that. So there wasn't much of an electronic, well, there was electronic music, but it hadn't really crossed my path before. I'd probably heard like Autobahn and stuff that made it into the charts, things like that. But I was mainly listening to guitar music. I was into guitar bands. I was into writing songs on guitar. And that was the case up until, around the end of the 80s when, I went to winter of 1989, I went to Asia for 6 months. So I was 2 months in Nepal, 2 months in India, and 2 months in Thailand. And that's when I first got some exposure to the scene that, was just kind of starting off then of electronic music and parties and the things that we love. So then it started to shift away, but definitely the acoustic thing was very early for me. So then, that's right. I went through many years of electronic dance music, and I probably didn't pick up my guitar for 10 years, something like that. And then, in the early 2000s, through the direction my kind of life was taking, I went back into that acoustic thing for a while. And now I'm back on the other swing. The pendulum's swinging back the other way, and I'm back making electronic music again. So it seems to swing back and forth through my life.
And which artists were your biggest inspiration? Did you always want to become a musician?
That's a good question. No, I didn't really. And I didn't show a lot of interest in music when I was growing up. I mean, I did enjoying consuming music, listening to music, enjoying music, I did. But I never studied an instrument. I never had a music lesson. I never really had much thought about making music. My mum is quite a talented musician. She plays piano to quite a high level, and she studied violin for quite a few years, and she was always trying to encourage me to take piano lessons. And of course, many years later, I wish I had. But at the time, I was like, no, I just want to go out and kick my ball around in the back garden with my buddies. I don't want to sit here and study piano. And so it wasn't until many years later that I realized, that music was something that was gonna interest me. And I've still never had a music lesson, to be honest. I never studied music. I'm sure there's many people out there who will say, like, yeah, we could tell. but yeah, like I say, I mean, I really came out of that, that philosophy of like, okay, here's some basic tools. Now go and start creating with those tools that you have. So, there are obviously musicians out there who studied many, many years. They studied their craft, they studied their instruments, they studied music theory, they know their scales, they know their chords. And I have utmost respect for those people, but I wouldn't call myself a musician of that kind, because I can't say I put those hours in that those people have. I kind of have just more of a gut feeling about things, I think. And it's about how, for me, music's not so much of an intellectual exercise as about how it makes you feel and what it makes you feel. And so it's not about like how many notes can you jam over this sequence of jazz chords. It's like, can you make one note that makes you feel like something incredible? Like, I mean, I'm super into drone music, like a single held chord that goes on for minutes, and you just sort of sit there and bathe in it. And then it's about like, okay, what's going on here? Where's the movement coming from? What's the texture? What's the character of the sound? It's much more focused into that. For me, that's where my sort of musical interest, is coming from. But I'm not like I'm definitely not an accomplished musician in, like people who've studied for many, many years music as a formal discipline. That's not what I come from. That's not my background.
You mentioned you visited Asia. You've traveled in Asia for months, actually. That's when you ended up in Goa the first time, I guess, right?
Funnily enough, it's not. No, I was in India. This is the winter of 1989, and a bunch of people who I would end up meeting and working with and collaborating with were there in Goa in 1989, in that same season. And it was just one of those funny things. I was in Varanasi, which is Varanasi, trying to decide at that point whether I was going to go north or south in India, which basically meant, was I going to go north up to Kulu Valley, or was I going to go south down to Goa? And I just by, for whatever reason, met this guy, a French sadhu. And he was like, no, you don't want to go. Don't go to Goa. It's like, it's terrible. It's full of tourists and, you're going to hate it. He's like, go to the mountains, go to the mountains and meditate in the mountains. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I mean, I was 19 years old, I just like took the guy at his word. So I decided to go north, and I went to the mountains, and I, spent a couple of weeks in Kulu Valley and then went on to Thailand. So I didn't go to Goa on that first visit, which always makes me, chuckle now looking back on things. So what actually happened was then I got back from Asia and I was in the UK, and then through people in my friendship group with my sister as well, who was also in London at that time in art college, and she was friends with Dick Trevor. And so I became friends with Dick as well. And then we started to connect to people putting events on in London, Goa trance themed events, people who'd come back from India and were playing music they'd heard in Goa. So actually, and it wasn't even tip parties at that point, it was pagan. which was Mark Allen, Chris Bow, Yaz were the DJs there, and we would go pretty much every time they would throw an event. We would go and that's where I heard like the early days kind of Goa stuff, Fax Records, that kind of thing, IQ stuff they were playing in those parties, that I was like, wow, this is really something. And hanging out in the chill out room and talking to people who were like, yeah, I was in Goa, I was in India, and it was like amazing, and I was like, wow, yeah, it sounds great. So actually it was through being in London, I was like, okay, I need to go back and see what's going on. So I went back in 93, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then went a few times after that. But that was the first time I went back to Goa, and then the scene was already pretty well established by 93. I mean, I was not there in the early days by any means. Yeah, but it was definitely happening. The scene was blasting in 93 for sure.
So you mentioned that around this time was your early exposure to electronic music. Was it the pagan parties, or was there anything else before that?
There was before that, but nothing that really gripped me. I mean, I was when I came back from India the first time, I went back to study. I didn't really know what to do with myself, so I went back to study philosophy. And I was doing this philosophy course, and I met and fell in love with a girl from Venezuela who became my girlfriend for a couple of years. And she was into electronic music and the early kind of rave scene in the UK, like well before I knew anything about India, not India, but I'd been to India, but before I knew about the Goa kind of music. And that was more, I guess, kind of 808 State, UK acts, guy called Gerald. I mean, late 80s, early 90s electronic music. And then I was super into the Orb for that first album, the Ultra World album. And then came kind of the London scene. And then, so the first time I was really hearing Goa music played at a party was the pagan parties. And those guys really turned me on to that music. And then I was like attempting to make some very, very basic tracks after going to those parties and coming home and trying to figure out how that worked and how you build tracks like that, And I was I had a flatmate at the time who'd done a little bit of studio work and was a lot more technically knowledgeable than I was. And he taught me some mixing tips and, like how to use the early DAWs. It was eMagic back then, which was running on a black and white Atari computer with a single MIDI output on a black and white monitor. And so he was like, yeah, like you build your drums like this. And I think I had an Akai 950 sampler with like 1 megabyte of memory, which I had all my drum sounds on. And then I had a Roland 202 little monosynth. And it just made a bunch of like pretty sketchy tracks that then we would like, sit around and listen to with friends. And then, people would say to me like, oh, that was, I like that sounded great. And I was like, yeah, really? They were like, yeah, you should continue. So I had some early kind of encouragement. And then out of that, those very, very early tracks, which I was probably working on for like 18 months to a couple of years, eventually became the demo that went to Novamute and landed me the first like Doof EP.
That one is the Love Mixes, right?
I know, Love Mixes. Yes, exactly. So the Love Mixes was effectively the demo for that Nova Mute deal. Yes, correct.
Yeah, you released it a couple of years ago and through your Bandcamp, and it's really good. I was just listening to it today. To me, it's really uplifting, dreamy, ambient, acid house, trance, techno, whatever you call it. But it's really heartwarming.
Thank you. It came out of a very heart-warmed environment. Like we were in that friendship group that I mentioned, like with my sister, with Dick Trevor, another good friend of mine at the time, this guy Sev, who was a DJ who'd also been to Goa and had a connection to he knew what music to buy, and we would all kind of hang out together, party together, and it was a very heart-opened, closely bonded, very, very kind of sweet and fun friendship group. So those tracks came out of, a very heart-opened space and wanting to make music to soundtrack that space that we were all hanging out in together, and like, okay, what kind of music do we want to listen to when we're, having fun and partying together to the technical limit that I had at the time, what I was capable of at the time anyway, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was wanting to say that listening to that album, I was wondering about the influences, because it's kind of sitting in between the earlier acid house sound of the UK and the later Goa trance sound that started to merge like 93, 94-ish. But obviously with the rudimentary kind of equipment, like just one synth and a sampler and then the sequencer, it's like not as polished as like Juno Reactor or other acts at the time were doing stuff. So that kind of explains that, okay, where it's coming from, but you already had that kind of vision, that kind of sound in mind that you were aiming for, right?
Yeah, well, it was very, it wasn't overthought, let's put it that way. It was very spontaneous. And you could say that I was sitting in between the acid house sound and the Goa sound in just where I was in my life at that point, so that's the music that I was making kind of reflects that. But at the time, I had a Tascam 688, which is an 8-track cassette multi-track with a built-in mixer, 8 channels. I think it had 2 aux sends for effects, so I could put one reverb and one delay. Very basic 3-band EQ, but you could record 8 separate tracks and play them back from a tape cassette. So it was like a very, relatively cheap home bit of equipment, but you could multi-track. So, that's what all those Love Mixes tracks were made on that 8-track machine. And then I used to drag that out to parties. And I would have a box of cassettes, multi-track cassettes, and then I would do live mixes on the 8 faders, mixing, in and out, like the 8 different parts that I had available off cassette, and play live at parties in people's houses and front rooms and stuff, and just had a ball. It was just like, it was so much fun. But yeah, I mean, you can't compare it with at some point I ended up being taken along to Ben Watkins' studio around that time, and it was a proper serious professional. I mean, he had like a massive mixer, proper sound room, everything like acoustically treated. I mean, it was professional recording studio, and that was like, I couldn't even dream of something like that at that point. That was like on another level.
And on the inspiration side, so you mentioned the parties in the UK, the pagan parties, and when you went back to Goa to experience the scene there, how was it for you? How did it change your life to experience that scene? Well,
it definitely did change my life. I mean, when I went back to Goa that first time, I had the feeling, I've had it a couple of times, but this was one time that it happened. And there's people say, there's a saying that, in every life, in the course of your life, there's a wave that forms, and it sort of sweeps through your life over the years. It's like a like a wave in the surf in the ocean, and it's sort of, if you can catch that wave, if you can get up on your board and you can ride that wave, it'll carry you all the way through. And going to Goa that first time, I had that feeling of like catching a wave. Like I was like, this is my wave. Like I'm, I felt like this is my people. This is my tribe, if you want to say it like that, like this is my, affinity group. These are the people who, that I feel like I'm one of them, and I felt like it was happening in just this very, fortunate timing and place where the scene itself was kind of on a rising wave. And there were people who were, day by day creating this scene out of thin air, out of their imaginations, and that's a very exciting thing to be a part of, when you feel like it's happening for the first time and something new is happening. It was this marriage of new technology that was affordable. People could make music at home. Synths were relatively cheap. Recording technology had gotten cheap to the point that you didn't have to go and sign with a label or get an advance of hundreds of thousands of pounds to buy studio time. These things were being put into people's hands, and then you could make a track at home, have a DJ play it at a party of thousands of people, and see the dance floor like raging to your track a couple of days later, like no release schedule, no like no A&R, no executives to try to negotiate with. It was like super exciting thing to be a part of. And then at the same time, this kind of scene as it was at the time, it's a tricky thing to talk about the Goa scene because it meant different things to different people. I can only say what it meant. Like the Goa scene, it's a little bit like that thing of like, 6 people standing around with blindfolds and they all have one hand on an elephant and everybody says something different about it. And the elephant is the Goa scene, no? Like some people feel passionately one way, some people feel passionately another about what was happening in Goa, because it was like a very complex, multi-layered scene with a lot of different people involved and people getting different things out of it. Like for me, it was, I was already into the kind of the travelings. I mean, already been in India, already travelled in Asia. I was kind of into already, let's say, that globe. And that's another thing. I mean, cheap air travel at the time. We were actually able to fly around the world relatively cheaply and go to these different places. And there felt like there was a scene. There was people excited about that. So then that was interfacing also with, as I say, with the technology, very, very early days of, digital, let's say, digital culture, barely any internet back then, even barely any mobile phone. I don't remember anyone having mobile phones in Goa. It was all like, if you wanted to call someone, you had to go to the little satellite telephone booth and like do a dial-up call with someone. It was like, I mean, early days, but super exciting. So all that excitement and meeting these like crazy and beautiful people, everybody with their story, everybody, plugged into this exciting scene of new music and psychedelic fashion and decorations and beautiful young women. I mean, still beautiful young women, of course, but my age, when I was young, it's exciting to be around those beautiful, beautiful people. So I just was like, yeah, this is the best thing ever. Like, I just wanted to be a part of that somehow. And then I thought, well, if maybe the way I can be a part of this and contribute is music because I was doing that already. So,
where does your artist name Doof come from?
Doof, well, it's a funny one because Doof became then... I tell you where it comes from. It's because when I was first hearing electronic music, and I was still into Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin, and I would put it down and I would say, it's that Doof music. They're listening to that Doof music. Like, turn it off. I don't want to know about that Doof music. And so a few years down the line, when I found myself making that Doof music, I thought, well, I better be honest about it. I'm just going to call myself Doof. Why try? So yeah, it was always the sound of the kick drum to me, like doof, doof, doof. Mm-hmm. And so, but initially it was an insult that I kind of thought up, and then I thought, no, okay, like now I'm making this music, so I just am Doof. But of course, then in Australia they independently came up with the same thing. They like Doofs were, outback parties, right, with electronic music. And I remember when someone first told me that, and they were like, yeah, in Australia they're having these Doofs, and I was like, that's amazing, no way. Like, it was a nice resonance. And then, funnily enough, another little resonance with that name is the fact that in German it means deaf, which I always thought was pretty funny as well.
The first EP released under the name Doof was the aforementioned Nova Mute release, the Disposable Hymns to the Infinite EP.
Right.
How did the demo lend you this record contract or this EP? How did it?
Pure luck, and pure luck, and pure luck, and also meeting the right person. Like, as I say, in this friendship group, Dick Trevor was part of that group. And this guy, Sev, that I mentioned earlier, who was the DJ who'd been to Goa and knew where to get Goa music in the early days before any of us other people did. So his sister happened to work on reception in Nova Mute. Mm-hmm. And she heard the music that I was making because she used to come to the parties that we were putting on, and she would see me doing these live things, that I mentioned with the cassette multitrack and stuff. And she was like, oh, I work for this label, you should give me your cassette and I'll take it in. And so I did, and unbelievably they were actually interested. I mean, I was because I didn't really realize or appreciate at the time that Nova Mute was the dance sort of offshoot of Mute Records, which of course is like got in Daniel Miller. It's an incredible early electronic music label. Now I'm in big electronic artists. But I wasn't really aware of that at the time. I just knew that this friend of mine worked at a label, and she thought they might be interested in. And I know for a fact that they would get cassettes sent in the whole time, and so many cassettes that they just couldn't even listen to them. Or so most, like people who would just send things in the mail probably wouldn't even get heard. So I was extremely fortunate that I had somebody there who actually took my cassette, put it on somebody's desk, and said, I think you should listen to this. And not only that, but then having listened to it, they were interested. So it just luck, really.
And this EP was still kind of this transitional sound, as we talked about earlier. It was still varied a little bit in terms of sound. How, if you look at the tracks, maybe In Flight was kind of having this early Goa influence already there. What do you remember about those tracks? How did they come together, and where does the title come from of the EP actually?
Right. Yeah, I came up with the title. The title is about it's about dance music, isn't it? It's like, well, it is for me. It's that sense that you can have or come across a dance track that in the moment, maybe when you're on the dance floor, you've got the right feeling going on. It's the right moment. The stars align. The right track comes on, and it just feels transcendent. It just feels like something that's lifting you beyond, it's almost like you can't kind of get your head around it. Like how is this music like even being made? Like it's just so abstract and like it's otherworldly. But at the same time, dance music is essentially disposable. Like, tracks come and go. Like people, it's not always the case, but quite often people make them quickly. They play them out a few times, and then it's on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, because there's always that thing of wanting to have that fresh hit of something you've never heard before, doing that to you on the dance floor. Like, I mean, it's great to listen to the tracks we know and love from many, many years also. But that title was trying to describe something of that, where you have like something that's like a hymn to the infinite. Like it's like has that profound effect on your, on your soul, on your consciousness, on your mind, but it's also disposable at the same time, Yeah, profound and somehow here one day and then gone the next. So that's where that title came from. It was trying to sort of describe that in some way. But those tracks came out of the love mixes. So the Gift of the Gods was kind of the track that was a through line from those early Love Mix days onto the Novamute EP, and then that was a track that was getting played in India at parties and in Goa. So
you basically re-recorded some of the demos that you've done at home in the studio? Yeah,
well, that was problematic actually, because this was the deal with Novamute, that they had this cassette, and they were like, look, we like what you've done here, but we don't feel like it's commercially releasable. So we want you to come into the studio. They had like an in-house studio in sort of northwest London. And they're like, we want you to come in and work with our engineer and re-record these tracks. And I was like, oh no, that's a problem, because it's very hard to do. Sometimes you just have a mix that captures a bit of lightning in a bottle, or some magic. It's not always possible to just go this is early days, because there was no digital files. There was no stems that I could just take into their studio and put through their desk, and it's the same performance. It's like analog synths, and the whole thing had to be re-recorded from scratch. So even trying to get the same sound on a riff on an analog synth, anyone who knows analog synths will tell you it's, good luck with that. It's like it's virtually impossible. Yeah. So
the gear you mentioned, I mean, I think the eMagic was on the Atari was kind of like the precursor to Logic or something like that, but it was just purely MIDI, right?
Yes, no audio recording in those days.
Yeah, and the 202 is basically like a small SH-101. You have to move the dials on there, and you don't have patch memory even there. So you just have one sound that you dial in, and that's it.
Yeah, the sound on the knobs is the sound you get. There's no patch memory, no way to save it, and fairly simple, amount of controls. But even so, trying to recreate just what happened in that performance that went onto the demo is difficult. So I did struggle with that, actually, going back into the studio, doing those Novamute sessions. And then the other problem with those sessions, apart from the problem it set me of trying to actually redo the tracks from scratch, was that then the label charged me for the studio time. So I was, for a few years after that EP came out, I had this thing where I was in debt to Novamute over the studio costs. Which was also like a bit of a difficult situation and took a while to resolve. So that whole going back into the studio and re-recording thing was a tricky one in the end. But, we did get an EP out of it. I mean, I would say those tracks on that EP, that was at a point where I was still trying to work out like what direction I was going in with the music. And it wasn't until I got past that and just past that sort of, just past that point, was when I hooked up with, the guys around Butterfly and Simon Posford and all that crew and youth, the scene around Youth. And then it started to become, Goa Trance. So that Novamute EP was just like, I was still a little bit struggling, trying to find out like which direction is this going to go in. But I think the Gift of the Gods track was probably the closest to what the direction I was going in.
The next EP, the Let's Turn On, you created together with Simon. So how did that come together? And Let's Turn On is just such a classic track, which has multiple versions. So what do you remember from that track and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, it means a lot, that track. That was, as I say, it was like one of the first. It wasn't the first track that Simon and I did together, but it was in the first 2 or 3 that we produced together. And it was one that really hit kind of the target we were aiming at, if you like, and kind of took off. So it was it has a very special place in my heart, that track. But that was another one that had exactly the same situation. We had a demo version that we'd recorded in Simon's home studio, and when it eventually came time to put it out, we had to re-record it because the demo version wasn't releasable, but it had a vibe. So we had to go back. But and then in a similar situation with analog synths and eMagic and no preset memories. I think we were using an Oscar synth, monosynth on that one, which is like, famously kind of squirrely analog synth. And Prophet 5, I remember Simon had an old ARP 2600. And so all those sounds had to be reprogrammed and repatched. And at that point, he had a big Kurzweil digital polysynth that was doing all the string sounds, and so that was all saved, luckily. But yeah, that track had to be kind of recreated. But yeah, that was a super exciting time because obviously, hooking up with Simon like very, very early on in his career, and we got along really well, Simon and I. Like we had a shared sense of humor. We didn't live too far from each other. He was living in probably like 15 minutes away from me in London at the time. So, we could always it was very easy to go back and forth and work. We were working at home, mostly in his studio in Battersea. So what happened was after the Disposable Hymns EP, Novamute said, we'd like you to do another EP, but we'd like you to work with a producer. So, you be the artist, but we want you to have a producer to guide things along. So they were like, who do you want to work with? If you could work with anybody, who would you like to work with? So actually my first choice was Pete Namlook from Vax Records. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, can I work with Pete? And they were like, we'll find out. And then they came back and they were like, no, that's going to be too expensive. Like Pete's in Holland and you're in the UK, and we don't have the budget to fly either of you in either direction. So we want you to find someone in the UK. So then they suggested Ben Watkins initially. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, that didn't happen. I can't remember why, but it just wasn't. It didn't come together. So at that point, I think I'd already been hanging out a little bit at Butterfly Studios, and I'd met Simon and I'd seen him working with other in the studios at Butterfly. So I think I suggested to Novamute, look, I'd really like to work with this young guy I met, Simon. And they were like, yeah, sure. That sounds good. So Simon and I went into the studio at Novamute, and we did Born Again track, and we loved it. We just thought, we thought we created something fantastic. Novamute, not impressed. It was not going in the right direction for them. They were not, they were not a Goa trance label. Fair play to them. That just wasn't their scene and their style. So they weren't interested to release that. So we took that track with us and continued working together. And I think we did. I think We Can Go to the Moon with the Bill Hicks samples in.
Yep.
It was done at Simon's Place. That might have been the first track that we ever did together, actually, because that had some riffs in it from the very, very early version of Mars Needs Women, which was a 25-minute track I used to play at parties with just a whole bunch of hilarious samples thrown in just to make people laugh on the dance floor. And Mars Needs Women was one of them. But it had some, I remember it had a riff, the lead riff in that I lifted out of that and we put into the I Think We Can Go to the Moon track. So there was that one, there was Born Again, and there was Let's Turn On. I think was the first 3 tracks Simon and I did together.
And then came Double Dragons as well. I think that also came on probably first on a compilation, right? But then there was also the Double Dragons EP.
There was, yeah, that was I think one of the first Doof tracks since the Doof Goa Trance thing got going, and I was working mostly in collaboration with Simon. I mean, to be honest, he was doing more than just producing on those early tracks. He was co-writing everything and contributing musical ideas, playing the keyboard, and it was a partnership at that point. But then Double Dragons was a track that I had done just by myself, and I went into Butterfly to record that one with Dan Zamani engineering. So I wasn't he was producing and engineering, and so Simon wasn't, if I remember correctly, Simon wasn't involved on the Double Dragons one. But yeah, that was pretty early days as well.
Yeah, and there was also the equally loved and classic, the Youth of the Galaxy EP.
Right. Youth of the Galaxy. Yeah, that's another one that sample comes from a TV show, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, which used to show on British TV in the evenings once a week, and it was a kind of cheap American kind of futuristic fantasy thing, but that sample was in one of the episodes, Youth of the Galaxy. And at that time, this is still pre-internet, so I would try to harvest samples from the TV basically, and I would just record a bunch of stuff just on the off chance that there might be something usable in it, mostly on VHS video cassettes, if not just directly onto a cassette machine out the back of the TV. And I was already growing up a fan of cheesy B-movie American sci-fi, black and white 50s movies, super low budget, all that stuff I was watching anyway. And then I saw a crossover with this kind of futuristic thing in the Goa scene, kind of high tech. So there was a bit of a crossover there with this funny samples that I'd been hunting out and hunting down and keeping on tapes. And that Youth of the Galaxy one was one of those, but it was nothing to do with Youth, producer Youth. But I have to say, talking about mentioning Youth,
all of these EPs did come out under his label Dragonfly, right?
Yeah.
Some of them came out on tip as well, but
yeah, I think Let's Turn On was I think Let's Turn On might have been the first tip EP. So I think could be, if I'm remembering that right. But I was just going to say, I'm really grateful to Youth, because he really opened the door to me in many ways. You know, he was like at the center of this, and he spoke about it a little bit in the podcast last week, you know, where he had this studio in London. He went to Goa, he came back, he kind of tried to create this ashram atmosphere, to try to create almost, you know, like this kind of hangout spot where people could come and just, you know, there was a bit of an open door policy, you know, to people to come and hang out there, and you know, I benefited from that. Like I was one of the people who passed through that front door and, you know, hung out and got to move in that circle that was, you know, really had him at the center. And I feel very fortunate to have been there and had that opportunity. I mean, I was talking before about the wave, this feeling of like catching the wave that carries you through your life. And I said it had happened a couple of times. And one of the other times that happened to me was in the studios at Butterfly. I remember being downstairs in a session, tip session, and there was a bunch of people in the room. I think Simon was there, Rajaram was there, Paul Jackson was there. There was, you know, and I was just looking around the room. They were all working on this track collaboratively, like mixing, doing a dub mix on the big desk there in the downstairs studios at Butterfly. And that was I had another little moment of like, yeah, I really feel like I'm exactly like where I want to be at this point. Like there's nowhere else I'd rather be. It was so exciting, so creative. Like those people were so fun to be around, you know. Very exciting times to be part of, and you know, youth's a big part of creating that scene, and yep. giving people those resources and allowing them to be creative in that way. That would have been definitely more of a struggle if he had not been there. If he hadn't been there in London doing what he was doing, then the you know, things would have been a lot less unified, I think, in terms of there being a meeting point for people, and actually, you know, yeah, more of a struggle. So he was a big part of growing that scene from, you know, a seed into something that actually giving fruit. Mm-hmm. So respect to youth.
And you also mentioned Rajaram, and obviously you had the releases at Tip, and one of the next EP that came out was the Angelina Weird Karma EP that was on right. Tip Records, and you already had some liner notes on the re-released version of the Let's Turn On album, where you're talking a little bit about all of these tracks, but I think I know this one has also an interesting story, the Angelina track. So can you tell a little bit about that one?
Yeah, that's a kind of a Goa story, because as anyone that's been to Goa parties will know, around the edge of the dance floor there are these chai mats that get set up with the like chai mamas who mm-hmm. you know, sit there and make chai tea and sell snacks, and you know, to the people at the party coming on and off the dance floor. So Angelina was the daughter of one of these chai mamas. And at the time, I don't know how old she would have been, but pretty young. I mean, maybe 10 years old, something like that. I guess she'd grown up around that scene. And of course, she had even though she was Goan, she had the name Angelina because Goa, unusually for India, has a strong Christian Catholic influence because of the Portuguese who settled in Goa. So you see their Christian, you know, Catholic churches, as well as, you know, Hindu temples, which you very rarely see around India. And Angelina, I guess, is a name that comes out of that tradition, the Catholic Portuguese tradition. So it was a Goan child, you know, daughter of one of these chai mamas. And it just so happened that one night at a party, I was on the dance floor and this little girl was dancing around in front of me, like just having the funnest time, just having the best time, like doing, like really dancing really crazy, but at the same time like she would like spot someone who was doing a crazy dance in their own style, and then she would just copy it and start doing their dance. And then like she'd look across the dance floor and see someone else dancing in a different way, and then she'd start doing their dance, and it was just cracking me up. Like, and you know, she just had this super mischievous, childlike energy that was just like, I was like, wow, what an amazing kid. So funny, like such a great energy. And so that stuck with me. I mean, I didn't know her. I didn't have a connection to her family, but I always remembered her, and I always remembered that moment on the dance floor. And so when that track was being written, and I was looking for, you know, something to call it, or maybe, you know, like a theme for the track, and I remembered that moment, and I thought, okay, I'll name it after Angelina. And then, funnily enough, the vocal sample on the record is my sister, because I had to find someone who was going to say the word Angelina, and I wanted it to be like a female voice, so I asked my sister to do it. So actually, my sister's on a couple of my records. She's also the voice on Star Above Parvati, the one that says, "I think it has something to do with being in the mountains." That's my sister as well. So it's always fun when she's on the dance floor and, you know, she hears her voice. Yeah.
You had 2 collaborations around this time. You had one with Crispo under the alias Synesthesiacs, I think, which resulted in a nice EP. And there was, of course, the track with Paul Jackson, Doof. So what do you remember these collabs, and what did you learn from those guys?
I don't remember much, to be honest. To be perfectly honest. I mean, the Crispo one, was that Crispo or was that Mark Allen? I thought it might have been Mark Allen that I did the Synesthesiacs with. Am I like completely not remembering that right? I know it was one of the pagan guys. I had remembered that it was Mark Allen, but maybe I'm wrong. See, I told you I don't remember. But I remember that that was one that we did in my home studio in London. I had an big old Allen and Heath 24 channel mixer, and I think we did it very quickly. The Synesthesia one, was Synesthesiacs also channel 9?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that was Mark Allen. That was my recollection anyway. It was Mark. So that was, they were done fairly quickly. The Doof one, I went over and did at Paul Jackson's place. I haven't seen Paul for ages, but he was like, I love Paul. He was such a great guy. He was always around that, you know, that scene, that butterfly scene. That's where I met him, and that's where I would mostly see him. Yeah, he was great. I love Paul because he was so like, he didn't give off the vibe that he was the person that he was somehow, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, you know, he was like super low key, like awesome sense of humor, like super funny guy. You know, he wasn't like in your face, kind of psychedelic, like colorful clothes or like, you know, like India style, like none of this. He looked like more like a, you know, South London guy, you know, like, but then he was making these awesome tracks. I mean, Transmission, it's like one of the all-time classics, man. And Voodoo People, oh my God, Voodoo People, I mean, all-time top 10. That was the only time we made a track together, I think, and it was quite a casual thing. He was like, yeah, come over, we'll hang out a couple of days, like, and it was super, I remember we did it on super minimal equipment, like, totality of the equipment we used, you could probably fit on a car seat. It was like literally like, you know, I think I bought my Atari over to his house, and then we had a 303, a couple of like very sketchy secondhand effects boxes, like super cheap reverb, sampler probably, but we had such a lot of fun making it, and the tracks got a great vibe still. I mean, I played it out at ZNA last summer in the Chill Out and sounded great. I mean,
it's a great track.
It's quite stood the test of time, that one. And in fact, that's what that kind of that's where I'm more interested in, not to jump ahead, but the music that I'm making now, that kind of down tempo acid is like what I'm kind of interested in doing right now. So that track was quite a precursor, actually, early days. I remember about doing that track with Paul, actually, was that him talking about, as we were making that track, he was talking about getting out of the trance scene. And I remember we were having conversations. He was like, yeah, I'm going to get into like R&B. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, man, it's like, I've heard some awesome R&B tracks, and it's just like, I want to get into producing this kind of like other kind of music. And I was like, well, okay, sure, man, we go for it. And then, yeah, I know what happened to Paul.
Yeah, I don't know either, but his genetic records are more experimental in a sense, I think.
Yeah, the genetic stuff was going already in a slightly different direction to the Goa stuff, for sure. But there was a couple of tracks off that genetic album that I used to play out back when you could still have a bit of freedom to play stuff in a trance party. It's more tricky these days to deviate from the expected sound, I think, and get away with it and not have people complain.
Unfortunately,
from what I understand.
Over the few years following the first EP, you released a number of tracks that later on ended up on the first album in '96, the Let's Turn On album. Even the Born Again EP, so the track that Nova Mute was not so fond of, got released on Matsuri. And then there was Mars Needs Women and Destination Bomb EP on Tip Records. And then after all of those got out, like basically you assembled them into an album under the title Let's Turn On. Why did the album came like this together? What was the idea behind it? Was it pushed by any of the labels so that you now have to release an album, or how did it come together?
No, it wasn't so much pushed by a label, but it just seemed to be the next step somehow. That at one point there wasn't really a plan. I was just producing tracks with no like particular plan to them. It was just like, okay, let's make another one, and just enjoying hearing them played out. And that was the exciting thing. And then at a certain point in time, after having made a bunch of tracks, it was like, well, I guess there's enough tracks for an album. And that seemed to be the next thing to do. Was like, okay, let's kind of gather a selection, try and make it like a strong selection, and put out an album. It just seemed to be, and I think it was around the time, maybe after, I think Simon had already done the first Hallucinogen album. And I remember thinking like, wow, like he pulled it off. He managed to like make an album that's like amazing, like it doesn't seem like maybe such an accomplishment, but then it seemed like a real accomplishment. Like, it seemed like something quite serious to pull off. And I was like, well, I wonder if I could do that. It was quite a tricky time, that like, it was a difficult time getting that album released just because of what was going on behind the scenes. There was a bit of I wouldn't call it a bidding war, but definitely Dragonfly were interested in releasing the album as well. And Tip were, and I was hanging out with Rajaram in Goa, and we were talking about releasing the album, and the kind of the natural, probably, path of least resistance would have been to put the album out with Tip, because I was hanging out with Raj and he was, excited to put the album out. When I got back to London after a season in Goa, Dragonfly made me a crazy offer for the album, and it kind of just wobbled me. I mean, they were offering me some kind of crazy money. I can't remember. Crazy money at the time. I mean, 25 grand, something like that. They were like, we really want to put this out. And I had a lot of people. Well, I had, also like, I had people speaking in both ears, like, oh, you should do it this, you should do it like, like go with Dragonfly, go with Tip. I was like completely confused. I didn't know what the best thing to do was. So that caused some tension behind the scenes, because I know the guys at TIP were like, well, why wouldn't you, like, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't you do it with us? They felt a bit not too happy about that. I wasn't sure what the best move was to make at the time. And right about that time, Darren, who was A&Ring for Dragonfly and had made me that offer. No, sorry, not Darren. Darren came after. No, Simon Holtham was working at Dragonfly at that point. And he had made me the offer. And right when this was going on, he left Dragonfly to go and work for Twisted. That complicated things even further. So eventually what happened, and what should have happened in the first place, was that thanks to a mutual friend of mine and Raj's, who was a fan and really wanted to see the album come out on TIP, he got us together, he patched up relations, and he was like, look, you should put this, put Nick's record out, belongs on TIP. And so that's what happened in the end, happily. But it was a tricky time, and I was super confused. I really didn't know what was the best thing, which direction to go in. With hindsight, I think I should have obviously gone with my friendship bonds, which was towards the TIP crew. But for some reason at the time, I just found it very hard to make, work out what the right decision was. Yeah, so that was a tricky time. But thankfully, TIP did put the album out, and that was the best thing that could have happened. And I was super happy that they did. Yeah, and then, that became a bit of a milestone for me. Like I say, that thing of like, okay, we've reached the point where, there's an album, there's a Doof,
I think not just for you, I think it's a milestone in this genre as well. I mean, it's that type of album that turns people to this type of music for forever, I think. If you first listen, and those tracks, I mean, still to this day, if I hear Mars Needs Women or any of those tracks in a DJ set, I'm like, okay, this is the time. No matter what I do, I need to go and dance a little bit, because it's just
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, for me, it was also this kind of transitional moment when I heard the album, and it's like a different experience and a different crowd, I guess. Even back in the day, people who were buying EPs were maybe closer to the scene, or maybe they were more like DJs or like looking for the freshest, newest thing. But buying an album, I think, had a different crowd even back then. And if you just start listening to an album from start to finish, and then you get into that kind of headspace, that kind of trip that the album is taking you on, then it can really turn you on to the music. So that's I think a job that the album did really well, even though the tracks were already out and maybe people who were in the scene knew them. You actually reworked some of them or remastered them for the album, and it became a whole story on its own.
Awesome. Well, that's great to hear. Thank you. That was the intention, I guess back in the days when people still listened to albums, that you could have a journey, have a journey through an album, let it take you on a trip somewhere.
And why the album title, Let's Turn On?
Well, the track was Let's Turn On, and there was, I don't remember what alternative album titles were discussed, not many, because it just seemed like a no-brainer. I guess, it's that message, isn't it? It's turn on, tune in, drop out. The Timothy Leary 60s, like turning on was getting psychedelically, plugged in. So it's kind of like, let's go, it's like, come on, let's turn on, let's do this. Let's, are you experienced? It had like resonances of all that stuff. So it just seemed, it seemed like we couldn't think of a better title. It just seemed like the perfect title, and I think it was.
Yeah, and the artwork is also kind of reminiscent of those 60s psychedelia stuff, and you drew it yourself, right? The album cover.
Yeah. Well, the album cover was a collaboration. Mark Neal did the colorization and the textures and the kind of created the cover, but based on hand drawn black and white drawings that I'd done. So the front cover like the logo, the kind of the circle around, that was all done pen and ink by hand, and then scanned in by Mark, and then filled in with textures. And also the mandala, the picture on the back was all drawn by hand, black and white ink on paper, which I still have, actually, the original black and white one. And then I spent the funny thing with that album art was that I think we had I don't remember how many days we had to work on it, but it wasn't many. And there was a budget for Mark's time of, let's say, I don't know what it was, 3 days maybe we had to work on the album. We basically spent 2 3/4 days of the time we had just working on that back cover picture. Because it was so complex, there was so many little areas to fill in. He had to lay in all those textures by hand, piece by piece, working on different, I don't even know, what magic he was doing on his Mac, different texture apps and all these different things to kind of create that. And then it became the back cover. And then, we finished that and we were like, oh shit, we've got 4 hours left to do the front cover. So the front cover actually was a little bit of a afterthought, because initially I'd thought that mandala would be the front cover, and that's what I'd drawn it to be. Okay, that was going to be the image. But then I think once we started working on it, and once Mark saw it, he was like, no, I don't think this is going to work as the front cover. And I think he was right, because the front cover is much more simple. It's just very strong branding, as you might say, with the word Doof, and not so much going on around it. And he was like, no, I think we should go with that for the front cover. So then that was done quite quickly towards the end of that session of putting the cover together.
But did you already have the idea for the logo with the infinity symbol?
Yeah, I'd been drawing that for ages already. I used to, before there was even Doof, I would fill sketchbooks with pen and ink. I mean, at one point I thought I probably was going to be an artist, for my career, for something I wanted to do. Art was always my thing at school, and I was always drawing. I thought I was going to be a comic book artist. I was super into comics. I grew up reading 2000 AD from issue 1 all the way through into my teens, every week without fail. I mean, I was super into comic book art. I knew all the different artists. It was a big thing for me growing up. And I thought that's probably what I'm going to do. That's what I want to do. So I would sit around and listen to music and just fill sketchbooks. And Doof was one of the words that I would quite often write, just because I thought it was a cool word. And I would do different logo designs, and it was a word I used a lot in my sketches before I ever thought about having a music sort of project called Doof. And so the infinity symbol of the double O's came quite early on, even well before I was making music as Doof. I already had that as a logo for, I don't know, for nothing, just for the graphic fun of it. Yeah, and then of course when I started producing music as Doof, then I was like, I should use that. I had a few different Doof, early on, designs for the Doof word, but I always loved the one with the infinity symbol in the middle, because, trippy infinity, to infinity and beyond, disposable hymns to the infinite. It had that resonance for me, and it worked. I think it worked very neatly as a logo, as a branding thing. So so I already had that kind of in the sketchbooks, and I went back and pulled it out, and I think I did 3 or 4 versions before I hit on the one it was scanned in and used as the album cover art. Yeah.
There is one track, I think it came on one of the Tip compilations, and you already mentioned it, that's Mars Needs Women. So I just wanted to ask you, why does Mars needs more women?
Well, ask Elon Musk. Well, it's pretty quiet up there.
Yeah, I have a different kind of interpretation that came to me once, and this track kind of speaks a different language to me since then. It was Mars, the the male kind of energy in the universe needs the women as well.
So I like that. Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. Exactly. Like I said, I used to collect all these like funny vocal clips and things from movies. And that was one that it's from an old, like 60s trashy American sci-fi world being invaded by aliens, like from Mars. And it just always made me giggle. And I thought I'm going to use that in a track one day. It wasn't really like a lot of, like deep thinking behind the necessarily the meaning of it. I just thought it was a cool sample that had a nice vibe to it. Like it was kind of sci-fi, but also like pro feminine energy. I was always very aware of the feminine energy on the dance floor, and especially when I would play and later on DJ, it always seemed to me that if the women in the party were happy on the dance floor, then the whole party was going to be happy.
Yep.
So the Mars Needs Women, had that thing of like, it was like a cross section of a lot of things that resonated with that little phrase, like humor, trashy American sci-fi, futuristic, outer space, women on the dance floor, all like wrapped up in that little package of 3 words, So,
just 3 words.
Yeah, and I'm not the only person to have used it, of course. Like there are a few tracks, which few Mars Needs Women tracks that people independently found their way to the same thing.
Yeah, and funnily, I think Miranda also has a track, Mars Needs Women, and it has the same sample, and she's like, as a female Goa trance producer, so there you go.
Great. Fantastic, yeah.
I think the only track that you have written specifically for the album was Sunshine, right?
Honestly, I don't remember, but it could be right, yeah.
Which is a mid-tempo-ish track in the middle, so that just, to breathe a little bit between these high energy tracks.
I think exactly. It was missing something like exactly for that reason, to give a little bit of a breathing space between the more full-on tracks. Yeah. Sunshine, I don't remember too much about that track, making that track. I know I was working alone on that one. And the title, it's one of those ones that, again, I had like my little collection of vocal samples. I had a list of track titles that I would just write down when they would occur to me. It could be on the dance floor. It could be like walking around or just hanging out, or someone would say something. And I would be like, oh yeah, I should, maybe I can use that one day for a track title. So like Sunshine, obviously Sunshine, Shrine, like that little double word play. It occurred to me one day and I wrote it down, and then it seemed to fit with that track. I remember, Simon's got a track, the Gamma Goblins track, and that came out of exactly that way. We were on the phone one day and I was like, hey, what you been up to? And he's like, oh, I just went to get, he was traveling somewhere. I think he had to get like a shot, like a gamma globulin shot. And he was like, oh, I just had to get this like shot, gamma globulin. And I was like, oh, they shot you full of gamma goblins. Nice. And he was like, we were laughing about it, like ha 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 ha. And then he was, and then so that went on his list, and he ended up using that for a track one day. But just like would come up in conversation, like these funny things, and then someone would like remember them one day, use it for a track title. So I think the Sunshine was kind of like that. Actually, I love that. I love that Sunshine track now, and I enjoy to listen to it still. And it's because I'm more making and listening to more mid-tempo electronic. So it's actually, that again, that kind of track is something I've moved towards, later on in my life. And it was like a first little, I guess movement in that direction.
Yeah, and you can say maybe the second move was the final track on the album, Stars of Parvati, because this was released as an up-tempo track before on the Blue compilation of Tip, but this version is a down-tempo version.
Right. Yeah, exactly right. And I always was listening to down-tempo music. I wasn't like a super dub head, but I was listening to dub. In the end of the 80s, Aswad released this album called A New Chapter of Dub, which was like their studio dub album, and it's still one of my all-time favorite albums. I actually, on one shopping trip up to Virgin Megastore on Oxford Street in London, I bought that CD, and I bought Talk Talk Spirit of Eden, which is another one of my like all-time lifetime favorite albums, and they were both on the same shopping trip. So that was like coming back with the Motherlode. But that Aswad New Chapter of Dub was like on heavy rotation for years and years, and you know, that sort of orb vibe of like dub, down tempo, dance music crossover. You know, I love that, and I listened to a lot of that music myself at home, and I always wanted something to represent that end of the music spectrum as well. So I think initially probably it was going to be the up-tempo mix, and then at some point it was like, well, why, it's the last track on the album, let's go in a different direction and do something like super down tempo. And because that was also part of my musical interest, you know, the next Doof album went even more in that direction, and like you know, there's like a couple of properly like ambient tracks on there. I love ambient music, and I love, you know, super down tempo stuff as well. So I managed to fit one on the Let's Turn On album as well. Yeah, for better or worse. But
so regarding Let's Turn On, it was released by Dat Records. Right. And the interesting part is that it has a second CD of alternative mixes. So how did you compile all these tracks? Do you have a catalog of all DAT tapes, or?
I have a box of old DAT tapes. Yeah, catalog is too much of a fancy word. There's no catalog involved, but there's a box of DAT tapes. Yeah, that I go back to and trawl through, and I still have one working DAT machine. Yeah, so I'd known Mark from DAT Records for years, because he used to be a good friend of Tsuyoshi, and he was around the Matsuri guys in London in the 90's. So I'd known him already for quite some years, and met Fede later. But those guys approached me to do the re-release, and they were like, well, look, you know, we'd like to make it like a package. So they sent me back to the DAT box, and they were like, what can you find? What can you dig out in terms of like, do you think you have an alternative mix for each track on the Let's Turn On album? And I was thinking, well, I'll look, but I think, yeah, possibly I could dig up something for each track. And I thought for a while about releasing a kind of unreleased mixes collection just myself before those guys had mentioned it. So that's eventually what became the second CD of that package, was various like alternative mixes that had been done and were sitting on a DAT tape somewhere. Because it used to be, more often than not, once a track had been, again, this is a thing about working with, you know, in the pre-digital audio recording days, a track would go up on a mixing desk, and you'd have your EQ set, you'd have your effects set, you'd have everything set up on the desk. When you broke that track down to work on the next one, doing a recall was almost impossible. Like, there's no way you're getting that track up again on the desk with all the effects and everything as it was. So it was like, okay, we've been working on this track for a week or whatever it was. We've done the main mix. Everything's set up on the desk. Before we break it down, let's like rinse it out a little bit. Let's do 2-3 different versions. Let's try like a live desk mix, just bringing stuff in and out, and just try to get a little more, or maybe doing an ambient mix was another version of that. It's like, okay, we've done this trance one. I like this riff. I like this, drum sound. Let's bring the tempo down and let's do like a dub version while it's all up on the desk. Because once you take it down, it's gone. There's no going back to it. Working these days all in the box, as it were, is just like a dream, because, you can just go back to a track you were working on a year ago and load it up, and there it is. It's like exactly as you left it. But it wasn't the case back then. So we more or less always did 2 or 3 alternative mixes of everything, and that's how the Star Above Parvati dub version was there. And there's a couple of desk mixes anyway on that CD2 of the Let's Turn On, and then some were like alternate like arrangements that were done in the computer. But yeah, it turned out that there was enough for a second CD of unreleased mixes. So it was a good idea from the Dat Records guys to go back and look.
Yeah, you mentioned how your studio evolved over the years, or how you worked on different tracks in different studios. What was the setup like when you re-recorded the tracks or remastered them? And was there any kind of equipment, any synth or anything that you felt like, okay, it was really an improvement for the project? Or was there anything that was integral to the Doof sound, like an effect or a synth or something that you think that really is important in how that record sounds?
Yeah, sure. Technically things were pretty basic, I would say. One of the things that I think gives those 90s tracks the character that they have is that everybody producing music tended to have a different collection of gear that they just managed to put together. Someone managed to get hold of this synth or that effects box or that desk or whatever it was, and it was all different. Like, I don't think anybody had a duplicated, collection between all the artists. So, I mean, obviously these days, that's still true to a certain extent, but like with the digital production, people tend to have the same, they're all using Serum or Omnisphere or whatever it is that they're using in their tracks. But in those days, it was a bit more funky. So I'd sort of scraped together whatever I could find, basically. I mean, this is all still pre-internet as well, so there was no like Reverb.com or no eBay to go on and just like search for a 303 or search for a whatever Oberheim or something. It was like, you had to wait until someone was like, I've got a mate who might want to sell like a, or it was like, it was hard to find stuff, or maybe in a secondhand shop, or like maybe someone had like, because also, yeah, we didn't have a lot of money either. Didn't have money to like go and buy something new either, like some new, like super expensive synth. So it really was a question of like, whatever we could find. So I would say I had, when I was working on the Let's Turn On album, I had a Novation bass station, which was like the first like plasticky keyboard version that was pretty sketchy. It kept like glitching and couldn't even follow MIDI notes, basically. I had my 202 still, the same one that I had since I started, which I still used on almost every track. So that was really important. I had a Korg polysynth. I don't even remember which one now. One of the silver Korg, like digital workstation polysynths. And I know a lot of the tracks, most of the pad sounds on Let's Turn On came from that Korg polysynth.
Might be a Trinity or something, or even an earlier.
Would have been a Trinity. Is that the poly thing? Yeah, that's the one. Yes, I had a Korg Trinity. Yes, I had a effects box. What was it? Was it Ensoniq DP4? Wow, this is going back a while now. I'm trying to remember. Was it a DP4? I know there was a DP. Yeah, Ensoniq DP4 Plus. Yeah. and an SPX 900, which did my delay lines on everything since forever. I think it was the first effects box I had. And then I used to buy, I never owned a 303 back then. I never found one for sale. So I used to borrow them from whoever would lend me one when I would try and get 303 in a track. I had my Akai sampler S950, expanded the memory up to 2 megabytes, which was awesome. So that was an important one for me because that would mostly, I didn't own any drum machines back then, so the sampler would mostly do all my drum triggering, all my drum sounds were on like floppy disk. Yeah, that was about it, I think. Oh no, I had, and then I bought the first Nord lead, the first one to come out, the red analog, and so I used that all over Let's Turn On. The Destination Bomb, that's all Nord lead, all that stuff.
And how did you find your music, the style of Doof? Because it's yes, the gear is different from artist to artist, but to me, the music of Doof is also playful, positive. So where does that come from?
That's just me, man. It's just, yeah. I think I'm quite a playful, generally quite positive person, and that's the music I wanted. I think you, at a certain point, start to think about what you're putting out into the world. Like in the early days, it's like, oh, I just want to make something, and it's the thrill is just to put something together that actually works and people enjoy. But after a while, there's another level to that, which is like, well, what are you actually putting out into the world? What are you contributing? Yeah, what energy are you putting out there? And I was always, and I still always have been, about putting positive energy out into the world, trying to improve people's lives a little bit, like make them happy, make them feel good. Because life is tough enough, man, as it is, and I understand, there's a whole genre of dark music, and people express themselves through that, and other people, that speaks to them, and that's fantastic, but it was never my vibe. Like, I always wanted to try to uplift and make people smile and make them feel good, and I think that you feel that hopefully through the music.
You also played live. I remember I saw your name on a couple of old Return to the Source flyers. So did you play completely live, or you had your music on DAT tapes?
I did, in the early days, play completely live a few times, but it was always terrifying because I would have to bring my whole studio to the gig and set it up on stage, and if something had gone wrong, or it had been stolen, or I would have lost everything. Like, that was my whole I didn't have like my live setup and then my recording stuff at home. It was the same. I only had one set of gear, so that was always like, made me really nervous that something was going to happen. It would get damaged, or something would get stolen, and I wouldn't be able to replace it. And then later on, as the tracks got more complex, I'd start to feel like, I'd spend, let's say, 2 weeks trying to perfect a mix of a track and get it as good as I could possibly get it to sound. And then I was somehow expected to show up and in half an hour of setting up time, recreate this mix that I'd spent 2 weeks trying to perfect in the studio. It just wasn't possible. And this is, there was no Ableton like live loops. There was not even then really like multi-track, like hard disk recorders that you could take on stage and do like at least a live mix from pre-recorded stuff. So I made the decision at some point to be like, well, I've worked so hard on these tracks. I just want people to hear the mix. That's the mix that I worked on. So then I would start to play off that. But I never pretended that I was, or at least I don't think so. Like pretending to play live, but playing off of that. It was always, what I would do is show up with, or ask, for a synth or two to be there on the stage, and I would make some noises over pre-recorded mixes because I just wanted to give the best version of the music to the crowd on the dance floor. But of course, these days it's much easier to do a hybrid thing because all they're in digital, and you can create a mix in the moment of stems and recordings that you made in your studio that sound great, and you can, obviously it's a different world now with this kind of music tech stuff, but back then that was a tricky thing to negotiate. Like, how do you play this music live? Because it wasn't like a rock band that you could just show up and kind of thrash out a version of a song that's like, guitar, bass and drums. I mean, it was, densely layered tracks, finely mixed, and how do you even reproduce that in a way that makes sense with a 20-minute sound check? Yeah.
Which were your most memorable performances as a DJ or as a live artist?
First of all, initially I didn't want to be a DJ. I knew a lot of DJs, and I was happy to hand them tracks to play. And my interest was really in production. And I wasn't so interested to stand up on stage and be the guy who was playing. I'd rather be on the dance floor, to be honest. That was like back in those days. I'd rather be on the dance floor dancing and producing tracks at home. So I wasn't DJing at all until like fairly late on in my, sort of Doof career. But I would say memorable performances, the Let's Turn On release party was a memorable one. It was in Shepherd's Bush Empire, which is like a kind of theatre venue in London, like a fairly decent size venue. I don't know how many people, 5,000 people, something like that. But it was a moment in time, obviously super exciting for me because I was presenting the Doof album, but it was quite at a sort of peak time of the 90s scene as well, where Goa trance had become a kind of relatively established thing that people knew about. There was a lot of energy around the scene at that point, and that was a super exciting. And that was the first time my mum and dad came along that night, which was super funny.
What was their reaction to the crowd and to the whole?
They loved it. I mean, there was, they'd never been around that scene before. They're very, kind of traditional people, but always very, they were always very supportive to me. And they were always, like I say, my mum was a musician, she would play music. My dad loved classical music and jazz. They both are into art and performance. And my mum was, would do like amateur productions of musicals and stuff in the local community. And, she was a dancer, but they hadn't seen me play before. So they came along to this show. And I think initially they were in the queue, like outside. I don't know why they didn't go straight in through the, I think they didn't even understand anything about a guest list or where they were supposed to go in or anything. So they just joined the queue outside the place. And then I think people were like looking at them like, who's this old like couple? And someone asked them, and then they're like, oh, well, yeah, we're Nick's mum and dad. And they were like, oh, wow, like Nick's mum and dad. And they got like ushered up to the front of the queue. And, like, they were like, everybody was so nice. Like they were all so friendly, and they loved it, man. I mean, they just loved it. And of course, like, it was, they said, super proud to see me up there on the stage, everyone enjoying the music, and they had a great time. And so did I. Yeah, that was definitely a memorable one. And I think DJing wise, well, I mean, one that comes to mind is closing the Boom Festival, like back in the day. I don't know when that was, 2006, maybe even earlier. But I was the last DJ to play on the last Monday on the main dance floor. And that was definitely a memorable one as well. Yeah, big one, definitely one of the biggest crowds I played to.
Sort of rounding up the classic 90s Doof sound era, I have one question about the remixes that you did, because there were some quite spectacular tracks out there that you collaborated remixes on, like Prana's Message to East Edge is one of my all-time favorites. The remix version that you've done, I think it's out of this world. It's really a beautiful one. Everybody in the scene should know that track. I think it's spectacular. But you also done like a remix to Hallucinogens, classic LSD Code 4's Near the Divine. There's Infinity Project, Hyperspace that also has a Doof remix. So you've done a couple of remixes. Which one was your favorite remix project, if you can name one of those?
I mean, I would have loved to have done more remixes. I really enjoy doing remixes. I think the one that I think probably worked out the best was the Code 4 one, which came from my connection with Gargill. He asked me to do that, and I remember at the time thinking, really, because Gil, he comes out of the whole kind of, he has that thing of the, Shiva Baba's, Sadhu's kind of angle, and I really wanted to do something special for that. I played that one also at ZNA on the dance floor last summer, and as part of my Doof set, and I remember thinking, wow, this one actually really works. It sounds great. So that definitely, I think, worked really well. The Hallucinogen one, I was super happy to be asked to do it. But the original LSD track is so great, and it's one of my all-time favorite Goa tracks. And I just, to be honest, I didn't know what to do with it. Like the track is so perfect, that was a difficult one, because I was like, I don't think I definitely can't make it better. So it's just such a perfect track as it is. So that was a difficult one. So I just, I did my best with that one, and
you basically did your own take of it.
Exactly. I just tried to doof it up, but that was a hard one. That was like really a hard one to try to tackle, because I could have spent a year on that one and just trying to make it right, And the Prana one's nice because that was really quick. I remember we had one night to do that remix. I think Tsuyoshi had booked us some studio time in this guy Choki's studio in London. Choki Tunes was a label. And we were in Choki's studio using Choki's 303. I think Dick Trevor was helping me out on that one as well. I think he was helping me engineering and kind of just hanging out and vibing with me in this strange studio I'd never been in. And so we did that one really quick. That was one night session, in and out.
This was the first episode of our interview with Nick Barber. Stay tuned for the next one, where we talk about the later years of the Doof project and Nick's other musical endeavors.
Thanks for listening, people. If you enjoyed the podcast, hit the like button and be sure to subscribe and share the show. If you have any ideas, questions, leave a comment or message us on Facebook.